Do you like to play chess? I do. It doesn't seem like there's too many people around anymore that play chess. I wonder how many there are compared to what it was 30, 40 years ago. But have you ever heard of the name of Bobby Fischer? Yes, he was a genius, but he also had an interesting psychological decline. Here's the book we're going to be going over with Dr. Joseph Ponterotto. The book right here is Psychobiography of Bobby Fischer, and Dr. Joseph G. Ponterotto is a PhD, a professor of counseling psychology, and coordinator of the mental health counseling program in Fordham University in New York. Prior to arriving at Fordham University in 1987, he was a member of the counseling psychology faculty at the University of Nebraska. And it's a fabulous book and just one of many. Let's welcome to the show Dr. Ponterotto. Welcome, Doctor.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carlos. It's good to join your circle of insight. I look forward to talking with your listeners.
Thank you very much. We love to have you here. And this is always fascinating when you get a psychobiography, especially of a gentleman like Bobby Fischer, because he was like a genius, and I'm getting kind of flashes of I forgot his name, Mr. Nash is all I can remember.
Boris Spassky?
No, Mr. Nash from A Beautiful Mind.
Oh, yes, John Forbes Nash.
That's what it was, exactly. Thank you very much.
John Forbes Nash, yes.
But before we get started on your fabulous book, what got you interested in doing a psychobiography on Bobby Fischer?
Well, it goes back to the years of Bobby Fischer in the late 1960s, early 1970s. As a 14-year-old boy in the Bronx, many of us were following the match between Bobby Fischer, our American hero, and Boris Spassky, who represented the strong Soviet Union chess-dominant country. So many in my generation got fascinated by chess and were riveted to the match. So I've been following the life of Bobby Fischer, as have many people of my generation, throughout the years. And when he sort of went off the board, so to speak, and kind of went into his wilderness years, many of us wondered what happened to Bobby Fischer. And then when he passed away in 2005, as a psychologist, I said, what happened? What is the mystery of Bobby Fischer? And was he mentally ill? Was he just eccentric? Why did he quit chess? There were so many unanswered questions about such an iconic, historic, famous figure that I decided to use my psychobiographical research skills to try to understand more about the mysteries of Bobby Fischer and then share that with the public and with the wide readership.
Fabulous stuff, and we truly have gained a lot from it. So let's get into it now. What are some of the things you started finding out about Bobby Fischer?
Well, there were a number of questions I had about Bobby Fischer. We know that he was the greatest chess player that ever lived up until that point. So one question was, how did he get that good at chess? Another question is, what happened after he forfeited his title in 1975 when he was supposed to defend it against Anatoly Karpov? Why did someone, a genius at the height of his career, why did he abandon chess? What was happening there? As you may know, he also became anti-Semitic in later life, though he himself was Jewish. So what led to his own internalized anti-Semitism, and what caused that? So these are some of the unanswered questions about Bobby Fischer, and my 5 years of work on the book tried to answer many of these questions. So I don't know, maybe you can start with a specific question, and I'll pick up there.
All right, let's start off with the one about how he became so good at chess.
Okay, well, a number of factors. This is a sort of a coalescence of factors that came together to create one of the greatest geniuses in history in this particular game. One was some genetic predispositions. His mom was very intelligent, was multilingual, speaking 6 languages, was highly educated, eventually went on to get her own medical degree. His biological dad, Paul Nemenyi, was a scientist, a mathematician who developed his own theorem called Nemenyi's theorem. So Bobby had some genetic predispositions to both memory, visualization, focus, spatialization. But he also inherited some tendencies towards I don't want to say paranoia, but a mistrust. There were some psychological issues as well in his family history. So those were the genetic predispositions. And then you have to think about the context. He was born in 1943, so during World War II. He grew up during the Cold War. There was a lot of tension between the Soviet Union and the U.S., obviously. His mother, who had studied medicine in Moscow for a while, came back to the U.S., and she became a subject of FBI surveillance. So throughout Bobby's childhood, his family was being followed by FBI agents, so there was stress of the family. And during this stress, Bobby found the comfort of chess. Chess was always there for him. So Bobby became infatuated with chess, and chess became sort of a solve for him. So during the stress, of his mother's life as a single parent and hardship times financially. And Bobby was awkward in social situations. He found chess as a vehicle to self-identify, to build self-esteem. So he then began to spend hours and hours at chess. So we know from research that some genetic predisposition with practice, the deliberate practice at the game, leads to elite performance. And researchers think it takes about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. So by the time Bobby was 15, he had amassed about 10,000 hours of practice. He had genetic predispositions. He found a home and an identity and a family in the chess community. And all of these factors coalesced for him to be very great at this game of chess.
Now, in your book, that's really fascinating stuff. In your book, you mentioned he had a tumultuous relationship with his mother?
Well, it depends on what source you read, what biography. But he had a sort of an ambivalent relationship. His mom was very strong-willed, as was he. His mom was a single mom, raising Bobby and his sister Joan, who was 5 years older. Because she was being followed by the FBI, she had trouble keeping a job. So the family traveled around a lot from job to job. And she was strong-willed. She wanted Bobby to do well in school, to have friends. And Bobby would have nothing to do with it. All he wanted to do was play chess ever, was a quote that he said. So I think he batted heads with his mother, Regina Fischer. At some point, though, I think his mother saw that chess would be a possible career for Bobby, and she wanted Bobby not to be impoverished like their family was. So she started to encourage Bobby. She started to support him and raise funds for his travel to tournaments. So they had a tumultuous relationship at times, but also a loving relationship. They were close throughout Bobby's history, although they were on and off again. But interestingly, when Bobby was 17, his mother, Regina Fischer, was a very well-known feminist and peace activist. And during the 1960 to 61 peace from San Francisco, March for Peace from San Francisco to Moscow, she left Bobby on his own. So Bobby lived in their apartment in Brooklyn on his own. So Bobby was kind of raised by himself from 17 on. So there is a sense that maybe Bobby felt a little abandoned, not having a mother figure. He didn't have a father figure. And so there was always a tension there. There was a deep love and respect, but also a sense of deep hurt and a deep tension. And that's something that stayed with Bobby throughout his life.
That's tough thing to deal with. What about his father? Was he ever present?
Very interesting question about his father. When Bobby was born in 1943, his mother, Regina Fischer, put Bobby's father as Gerhard Fischer, which was Regina's wife, who she married in Moscow when she was studying there. Gerhard Fischer and Regina had Bobby's sister, Joan. He was Joan's father. But when Regina returned with Joan back to the U.S. to escape the Nazi rise and the Stalin rise, Gerhard never joined. So we believe Gerhard was not Bobby's biological father. But in the book, we highlight that she had an affair and had developed a strong relationship with Paul Nemenyi while studying in Colorado. So most biographers, including me, believe that Paul Nemenyi was the biological father. And Paul Nemenyi was in and out of Bobby's life. At times he would visit. At times he would send financial support to Regina for Bobby and for Joan. But they never married and they never stayed together. So he was another distant figure. And Bobby felt, I think, a little abandoned by Paul Nemenyi. He felt a little abandoned by his mother, Regina, because she was very often on marches and protesting. And I think Paul and Regina, both being of Jewish descent, I think he started to internalize being Jewish with abandonment. And that's where some of the roots of his later life anti-Semitism, we believe, originated.
Well, that killed one of the questions I had for you. That was good. That's one way to do it.
Everything is interrelated and interconnected, so we'll revisit the question. So go ahead. What's your next question?
Well, let me ask you this. This could be speculation, of course. It sounds like that battle with Boris Spassky then might have been just more than a chess game. It sounds almost like a battle of cultures as well.
Well said. I don't know if you remember the 1972 chess match, but it's the most covered chess match in history. There's a world championship going to come up in October in New York with Magnus Carlsen, the new world chess champion. But until that time, it was the most covered event in history. And during the height of the Cold War, it was really a battle between a lonely, self-confident American who was self-trained and self-educated in chess with very little financial support battling an institution that represented Russia. The Soviet Union was the class of world chess which they associated with intellectual dominance over the West. So this was a match that was closely followed by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who actually called Bobby to offer support, and Leonid Brezhnev in the Soviet Union. So it wasn't acceptable to have a nuclear war, but it was acceptable to play out a Cold War on a chessboard. That was safer. But the interest politically and socially and economically was totally present there. So, yeah, it represented a big battle, and it just riveted the whole U.S. population and the world population to chess. So you asked about how chess popular was in opening your show. And back in 1972, membership of chess federations grew to exponential heights, and chess careers started to blossom. People could get work playing chess and teaching chess. So it really revolutionized the game and made it the world game. Just like soccer was the world game, now chess was a second world game. And it was Bobby Fischer and his match with Boris Spassky during the Cold War that created such an aura and dominance of chess in the world. So, yes, it was a lot more than a game back in 1972.
Let me ask you this. Absolutely. Let me ask you this in regards to, you said the mother was involved in a lot of protests.
Yes.
I didn't get to hear exactly what kind of protesting.
Okay, well, she was an intelligista. She was of Jewish background but had some communist leanings, as did many in that time. So, you know, people who were against communism and people against Nazism gravitated maybe to a communist affiliation. And this was during the late 40s, early 50s, when we had the communist scare, McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover. And so she was involved in political activities that were communist-leaning, but there were many people. And in the U.S. at that time, Americans started to associate communism with being Jewish. It was the time when Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were tried and convicted and executed on espionage. So there was a real fear of communism. And she was involved in human rights. She was involved in nuclear disarmament. She was involved in women's rights issues. So she spent a good portion of her adult life marching and protesting, particularly for nuclear disarmament. And her very famous march from San Francisco to Moscow, where she actually met Madame Khrushchev with a big cadre of marchers from around the world, was to promote nuclear disarmament unilaterally because they were concerned about the buildup of nuclear war. So many people in the late 50s, early 60s, and obviously beyond when we got to Vietnam, were involved in protesting for peace, protesting against war, and protesting against nuclear armament. And Regina Fischer was a leading national figure. So although she's known mainly as Bobby's difficult, challenging mother, in her own right, she was a leading feminist, a leading peace advocate, and she went on to become a nurse and a doctor, and she's a significant figure in history as well, although she sometimes gets the short shrift of coverage in the media because of her strong-willed battles with Bobby. So yes, she and others in that time period were often involved in protesting nuclear armament. That's
interesting, because I guess I was looking at the connection there, because it looked like there's some kind of side story going on with her protesting and obviously challenging Russia and trying to get the disarmament of nuclear missiles. And then you have Bobby over here, another Fischer, battling Russia via a chess proxy war.
Yes, there is a connection. Bobby was very patriotic. His mom was, again, trying to fight for peace. There are a couple issues. One is that Bobby felt a little abandoned because he was young when Regina went on many of these protests and marches, and he didn't have a father at home. He had an older sister, but she had her own life to live. So I think in some ways Bobby admired Regina's strength as a woman and as a mother and as a leader of some of these protests, but I think he also felt kind of abandoned. And he also began to dislike Russia because, Russia kind of took his mom away. The mom had studied in Russia. Now she was marching to Russia, which means she wasn't with him in New York. So I think he started to become very patriotic American. He wanted to beat the Russians. They had dominated chess. He wanted Americans to do better in chess. So he had ambivalent feelings about his mom and her involvement. He started to develop some antipathy for Soviet because they were so dominant, and he felt that they They cheated at these international tournaments by playing to draws with each other, so they would save their energy to play against Bobby. So he developed almost a hatred for the communist Russian chess system because he felt it wasn't fair and it was preventing him and other Western players from having fair tournament chance because the Russians were colluding to save their energy by drawing with one another or tying in their games so they can be at their best against Bobby. So, yeah, there are multiple sort of parallel stories going on. That's a very good insight you have there.
It happens every so often, Dr. Ponterotto. More or less than often.
Probably very often, I imagine.
Thank you very much. We got about 3 questions left I want to get in, and we got about 5 minutes. Let's see if we can do this.
Okay.
Link between genius and mental illness. I thought that was fascinating in your book.
Yes, and this is a century-long debate. I want our listeners to be very careful not to stereotype or overgeneralize here. Because of anecdotal cases, Van Gogh and or John Forbes Nash, the media and some writers have associated the greatest levels of creativity and genius with susceptibility to mental illness. And the same thing with Bobby and other great chess players before Bobby. If you're that creative and that good at something, are you more vulnerable or are you more likely to have mental illness? So there's a kind of an association there. But I think for our listeners, it's important to know that the research does not really bear that out, or it's more complicated. And let me go over briefly the key findings there, because I know we're short on time.
Sure.
The relationship between genius and the highest levels of creativity and mental illness are the following: that among all creative individuals, the very most creative are at more risk of psychopathology or mental illness. So of all the creative individuals, all of the geniuses, the upper percentages of creative and genius folks are more susceptible. However, among all people generally, creative people exhibit less mental illness than your non-creative individuals. And what researchers found, particularly by Dean Keith Simonton, who would be great on your show, he's a professor at UC Davis in psychology, he has found that it depends on the particular area of genius or creativity. That for writers and artists, there is a danger that the most creative are more susceptible to mental illness. But among the genius creative scientists, composers, and thinkers or philosophers, it's not a linear correlation. It's more curvilinear. So it depends on how genius the person is and in what field the genius is demonstrated. So it's very important not to overgeneralize. But what some neuropsychology research is finding is that for those that are dealing with the highest levels of genius and are prone to mental illness, that there's some neurological base that some folks who are highly creative, they have trouble filtering out stimuli. It's called Latent inhibition or signal filtering. So very creative geniuses, they're able to take in lots of stimuli, and that helps them to be creative and see patterns like complex chess positions. But if they don't have the capacity to navigate that and cope with that, they might be at risk because folks who have lower latent inhibition also are more susceptible to some serious mental illness. So neurologists and neuropsychologists are finding there may be a neurotransmitter, dopamine D, and some other transmitters that may be common in both creative geniuses and those with mental illness. But it's important not to overgeneralize or to stereotype because there are a lot of other factors in play. So generally speaking, in terms of my research on chess genius, I found no evidence to show that grandmasters have higher incidence of mental illness than average people. Every profession, including ours, Dr. Carlos, has a certain percentage based on national data. About 22% of the population in any given year will have some level of mental illness, and about 5% will have mental illness to the point that it hampers their ability to work, be in a relationship, have friendships. Now, Bobby Fischer probably was in that 5% that it impaired his ability to maintain his career, to maintain strong friendships, to maintain any kind of family stability. But I think it's very important for our listeners not to stereotype or overgeneralize. It's a very complex relationship. There is something going on there, but we haven't teased it out yet in terms of neurological research, and much more research is needed.
Our last question is, what lesson can we learn from Bobby Fischer's story?
Very important. So I know you have many listeners, and including many parents and families. Oftentimes in working with children as school counselors, as school psychologists, as principals, as families, we know kids who are in trouble because of academic difficulties. those who have gifts, whether it's math or violin or chess or whatever it may be, sometimes we're not sure how to help them. Do we promote their prodigious gift by giving them more lessons and letting them skip other activities to practice more violin or chess? What needs do child prodigies have in their families to help these individuals develop their prodigious gifts, but also to ensure that they have balance, which Bobby Fischer didn't have. He lost friendships. He lost interest in academics, quit high school at 15. So I think a main story is let's not just watch those who are at risk in terms of having trouble with school, but even those that are gifted, to make sure that their social, emotional, and life balance needs are met so that we can promote their gifts in these areas, but also make sure that they have life outside chess or violin or gymnastics or ballet, and that they're nourishing friendships, academics, other sports, social, emotional relationships. And families, I think, are at a loss at how to do that. So school counselors, psychologists, principals need early child intervention with families, with parents, to help them navigate their children who have obvious prodigious talent in some area. That's a very important lesson for our families and our schools.
Absolutely. Dr. Joseph Ponterotto, thank you so much again for being here.
It was my pleasure to meet finally the Circle of Insight, and I welcome any feedback from your show that comes about this way. And thank you very much, Dr. Carlos. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you. And where can we get more information about you before we go?
Where?
Do you have a website or anywhere you want to direct us?
Just go to Fordham University and click on my name.
Fordham University and click on Dr. Joseph Ponterotto. The book is Psychobiography of Bobby Fischer. Fascinating read. Absolutely fascinating. I wish we had more time to cover this.